And I can tell you that between 2022 and 25, the last 3 years, which were the Thailand's chairmanship of BIMSTEC, that's passing on to Bangladesh now. But over the last 3 years, we've seen a record number of such meetings in the history of 25 years of BIMSTEC. And that is eventually what carries the organization.
You're watching The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very, very special guest today is Dr. Constantino Xavier, a senior fellow in Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, better known as CSEP in New Delhi. He's also one of the finest foreign policy minds that I've ever spoken to. So I'm really, really delighted to have him with us today. And we are going to be talking about the recently concluded or about to conclude Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation Summit. If that's a mouthful, that's known as the BIMSTEC. And our Prime Minister was there. I think he's leaving. He's finished the summit today and then he goes on to Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Xavier. It's a pleasure to have you with us as always.
Thank you, Ram and Strat News team. Great to be here.
So, let's start from the obvious question. Given that all of these regional summits that take place, there are two things that I have noticed that happen. One, that each of the countries involved have their own agenda, which may or may not align with everybody else's agenda. And B, sometimes bilateral issues tend to take away from the multilateral discussions. Did you see any of that happening in this particular summit?
Yes, Ram, I think that's a good way to put it. You will remember, I don't, the 1980s and 90s when SARC was much of this. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation was much about sideline meetings in the hallways, in living rooms, over dinner, in different capitals across South Asia. And that is a very important function that SARC began with, which is a forum for leaders to meet, talk about bilateral, different regional issues also, and exchange perspectives. That's a very important function that BIMSTEC also plays. That is not to take away from the important agreements that have been signed about the vision towards 2030 that was approved now by the leaders, and the importance of BIMSTEC and its secretariat, which have several important sectors on climate, health, agriculture, security that are working. But you rightly point out that sometimes it's all about the leaders finding time to meet, and they have found time for the sixth time. In fact, 3 years after they had the fifth summit. So there's a certain momentum of the leaders now finding time every 2 to 3 years to meet and exchange perspectives on this region, the Bay of Bengal.
So, having said that, in your view, what can we sort of expect in tangible terms from this particular summit? What do you think we might actually see in the near future from this summit? Something that we can say, yes, because of the summit, this happened.
So one thing maybe I'd like to start with is what we haven't seen from this summit. And this was quite apparent in the Bangladeshi delegation that left Dhaka, that promised that it wanted to revive the economic and trade track within BIMSTEC. Negotiations towards a free trade agreement among the BIMSTEC member states began back in 2004 and have never really found success. It's a variety of agreements that they wanted to push for: a goods agreement, FTA, rules of origin, mutual assistance in customs matters, dispute settlement procedures, investment and trade in services. None of this really has advanced during the summit, which tells you that the larger free trade agenda that is seen regionally, a block of countries coming together, is basically dead and will not be revived. Now, another thing, though, on the positive side that I thought was quite interesting was the Prime Minister Modi's announcement about beginning a track of Home Minister meetings. Now, home is a very important ministry, as we know, here in India, and the same thing in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, and other member states, because they are about security not from a defense and military perspective, but they're security from a cross-border trafficking, illegal activities, insurgencies that are affecting still parts of Northeast India and much of Myanmar. And they deal with this predominantly. So, therefore, I think this Home Ministers mechanism that the Prime Minister has announced and declared India to be willing to host is in line with something we've been studying, which is a growing security track within BIMSTEC, which means countries now having growing comfort to talk about all these security challenges in the region that are affecting them. For example, in the form of the national security chiefs, which have been meeting 5 times, the last time in July in Myanmar last year. Um, and I think it's a very positive development. So that's, I'd say, on the positive side, one thing that we are seeing emerging within BIMSTEC.
The other interesting thing that always keeps cropping up at forums like these is that the other smaller members tend to be very wary of any suggestions put forward by a large member because they believe that that larger country would have its own agenda and they might want to push it down the other's throats. How does one work your way around that kind of a thing? How have they succeeded so far?
Ram, I'm going to be a bit strike a slightly different note. I get where you're coming from, and it's a very important question that has affected many regional organizations. The power asymmetry, including in SARC, for example, with India at its center. But I'm getting a sense that the opposite is happening, which is a bit counterintuitive and is certainly new in the region. My sense is today that maybe except for Bangladesh, which is going through a
Hmm.
difficult moment internally and has a weak provisional government and also has a difficult relationship with India, and in some ways chosen the path of difficult relations with India.
That's right.
Except for Bangladesh, I think most other countries today in the region are actually calling for India to take more of a leadership position. They don't want less India. They actually want India to support them economically, to lead in many ways this regional cooperation initiative. So I think all countries are realizing that because of the magnitude of the economic transformation in India, because of the political stability that we've seen in this country for several years now, unlike in any other country in this region, there is a certain, look towards India that is not the traditional fearsome look and let's keep India away, but there's also an understanding that we need more of India in this region. That includes Thailand and Sri Lanka, as we know. The Prime Minister has also had important bilateral meetings in Thailand and is going next to Sri Lanka. And in all
Hmm.
these countries, I see a certain concern still, obviously. I mean, if you're in Bhutan today, you will be concerned about the magnitude of the Indian market and any type of connectivity of migration, mobility coming into Bhutan. It's a small country of 7 lakhs people. But at the same time, also a growing interest in pushing India into these forums and saying we need to connect and discuss with India and also learn from India and partner India on critical agendas, whether it's economic growth, the climate transition, and issues such as health and security cooperation.
It's interesting that you say that because just the other day I was interviewing somebody from the India Sri Lanka Business Council or something like that, and he was complaining that we have put some kind of non-tariff barriers on Sri Lankan produce, and that has got them a bit upset because they're saying that we are not allowed to sort of sell our products in India, whereas India is pushing their products into our country, and that is causing a bit of a heartburn there. Is that a correct assessment to take? I mean, is that something, some weight to
There
that?
are, there are many irritants, Ram. There are many concerns still in this country, again, about the magnitude and the terms of engagement with India, no doubt. Again, I mentioned the example of Bhutan. You mentioned the example of Sri Lanka, where there are apprehensions about services mobility and, again, talent mobility from India towards Sri Lanka, about uneven market access. The Bangladeshis, even under the previous regime, have raised the trade asymmetry regularly. In Nepal, again, this has been an issue also. There are those concerns. What I'm saying is that I'm seeing elements of discussions in these countries where it's no longer a slam dunk that everyone is trying to keep India at bay or nervous about India. India, they're recognizing that their future developmental path, above all, economic security too, but that's a different discussion. But most importantly, that their future growth prospects in a very difficult time for this region, where many countries are trying to leave lower income bands to graduate now. Bangladesh, for example, in 2026. All these countries are seeking some form of engagement from India. And in fact, the opposite criticism is one I hear a lot often. I was in Colombo also last month, and I often hear that now the expectations that India should be delivering much more, should be doing much more for these countries. Of course, what that much more means is discussable. For maybe a farmer in Sri Lanka, that means less of India in terms of market
Yes, of
access.
course.
For the Bangladeshi jute industry, it means maybe less subsidies in India to protect Indian subsidies in industry. But that is the political economy that we're seeing playing out in many debates in these countries, where now the opinions are split and countries are assessing the ideal level of proximity to India, right? So they're also facing these discussions, saying how close should we be with India? Where can we benefit from India? Where is India a competitor, for example, in manufacturing on the textiles industry? But also, in the case of Thailand, for example, which happens to be the second largest economy in BIMSTEC, very interesting debates on how much do we need to do with India in terms of attracting foreign investment from India into Thailand so that we can balance also a little bit our dependence on China, which has been growing systematically over the last few years.
It just struck me that one of the things that this Sri Lankan gentleman told me was that apparently we have I mean, when we talk about, let's say, restrictions on clothing that they sell us, that they can sell to India, apparently a pair of socks is considered two items. I mean, each sock is considered one item. And so, I mean, silly things like that. I mean, who comes up with these notions? I mean, doesn't somebody think these things through?
So 2 points. I mean, one is that we are still hostages to decades of a old, introvert, bureaucratic, red tapist system, not only in India, across all countries in this region, right? These countries are laggards, they're latecomers to the logic of economic openness, trade, competition, and interdependence. So there's a lot of old bureaucracy and red tape that is going to count socks as two items, that is going to measure the length of each little nail that you're going to import to export. Those are obstacles and they're being dealt with. In fact, if you look at trade facilitation measures that India has been taking under the WTO, some of the studies by my colleague Riya Sinha show that India has been outperforming every other country in the region in completing several chapters and requirements under the WTO trade facilitation systems, right? So India surged ahead while other countries have stagnated or sometimes even gone backwards. In the case of Sri Lanka, for example, which has been going backwards over the last few years, may go even further backwards in some of these issues under the new leadership. The second point I want to make is a challenge for India that you rightly point out. India will have to see the long game of benefiting, of getting rid, of being a first mover, and therefore getting rid of many of these obstacles. And therefore being, what former Prime Minister Gujarat would say, the logic of asymmetry to its neighbors, right? Giving in. But in fact, India has been doing that. If you look at the exemptions and duty-free access that India gives to most of its neighbors under SAFTA rules, it's now close to 96, 98% to most of its neighbors. But still, it can do much more. It must do much more. And that's an investment, as for example, the foreign minister here in India has reminded us several times, in India's economy itself. If you want to grow, you need to connect with your neighboring countries. So any so-called altruistic benefit you're giving to your neighbor is actually an investment in India's own economy. But that again is a challenge because if you're in the jute industry in India, it's not easy to say we will stop subsidizing you because it's important for us to develop good relations with Bangladesh and liberalize that segment of the trade that we have with Bangladesh. So here also, as we know, as India opens up, there's different choices to be made and cost benefits that are being made in different sectors of whether you should up, how much you should open up, in what sector, and towards which of your neighbors. Because it's a very different game if you're opening up towards Nepal or towards Thailand, two very different economies, of course.
One of the things that, again, I'm coming back to this Sri Lankan gentleman was suggesting was that, Sri Lanka is facing a bit of I mean, the economic crisis is not really over because they still have payments to make. I think in 2028 or something, there's a balance of payment due. And they said India would be doing us a great, great, great service if they could even temporarily give us a zero tariff regime. Now, is that something that we can afford to do?
I mean, everything has a price, Ram, so you can afford, but of course, at the political price of some sectors in India, particularly in South India, they would probably not be happy about this. But I'm less interested in the sort of slam dunk zero tariffs logic. I think on trade facilitation, on infrastructure, that's where the investment has to go. And you can have on paper zero duties on imports and exports. If your trucks take weeks to cross borders, if you don't have the railway linkages with Bangladesh that you used to have in the 1960s with East Pakistan, if you don't have good multimodal connectivity between India and Sri Lanka, that now Prime Minister Modi has announced his vision for a land bridge, a multimodal land bridge between India and Sri Lanka. If you don't have a railway to Kathmandu, which is next door in Nepal, if you still don't have a railway link, for example, between the northeast of India and Myanmar, the only major missing railway link in Asia, between major economic growth sectors, then you can talk all you want about tariffs, right? And lose a lot of the resources which should be going, for example, into developing deep sea ports that are required, right? Most of India's intercontinental international trade kept being rerouted through Colombo in Sri Lanka. It's about time that India now changes legislative framework at home for ports, and invested massively in deep sea ports on India's eastern and western coast in order to connect with its neighbors. So I see those issues a little bit more important for India to invest in than now giving in for a 3-4 years frame to zero, to reduce from 90 or upgraded from 96 to 100% in terms of trade duties. What we need is that free flow of commodities in the region. And for that, we need basic infrastructure. And BIMSTEC, therefore, has been, as you know, at the forefront of many of these multimodal infrastructure plans, whether it's on power, railways, roads, and ports. This has been one of the most exciting initiatives under BIMSTEC, where these member states are looking together at how to flesh out the terms of infrastructure connectivity amongst themselves.
Before I go into the next question, I just want to remind our viewers that, just the other day, Dr. Xavier moderated a fascinating discussion on how railways, play a huge role in connectivity. And if anybody has the thing, anybody interested should look up that particular thing on the CSEP site. I think that you have it on your YouTube, right, as well. It's a really
Yes,
fascinating
thank you.
discussion, and I
It's by my
recommend it to
colleague Ria.
anybody.
Thank you,
Sorry.
by my colleague Ria Sinha. Yeah, that's by my colleague Ria Sinha. Thank you for that shout out, Ram. She's done this really interesting paper where she says we cannot think of economic integration in this region if we don't have the railway linkages within South Asia, but also towards the Bay of Bengal BIMSTEC region, with Myanmar in particular.
So coming back to BIMSTEC, you know, what do you think has been sort of, three key things that it has actually achieved since its inception? Could you just list out three major things that we should say, wow, BIMSTEC has done this, so it's worth continuing with? Because I am turning out to be a bit of a cynic if it turns that, you go there and you talk, and at the end of the day, nothing happens because of internal whatever. Each country has its own agenda. And coming back to my original question, that, give me three big things that BIMSTEC has achieved, which should
Difficult
give us.
question, and an important question, because we should judge these organizations by what they achieve. So, of course, I could point you out that now India has BIMSTEC has a charter, it has a formal structure, but those are only methods to achieve outcomes, right? And your question is about the outcomes. But I want to just highlight backwards one point, is that you cannot achieve anything if you don't have a functioning organization with rules of procedure, with a charter, with a secretariat that is endowed with expert resources and financial resources. A lot of that work has been done over the last 6-7 years now. In fact, this summit marks that culmination, that you now have a proper functioning regional organization, which in the last few days has signed MOUs on shipping, maritime, and health with the IORA and other regional organizations. So that being now set up, in terms of other examples of what I think BIMSTEC has achieved, I'd say there's two or three areas I'd look out for, where there has been progress. One is on energy cooperation. These countries now are sharing a lot in terms of renewables, grid connectivity. That discussion has accelerated over the last few years. There's now a BIMSTEC Energy Center in the south of India, has been operationalized, is sharing data with member states that allows countries now to think of their regional, of their domestic, economic, and climate futures, because energy is about adjusting to the future climate change, in relation to each other. So they're accessing
Mhm.
data, knowledge, facts from each other through that track. I think the second one is the one I had mentioned before, which is the security track. Between 2017 and now, over the last 6 years, 5, 6 years, the BIMSTEC national security chiefs have met 5 times. We know very little in public about the discussions because these are led by national security organizations, sometimes with a military angle, intelligence, police angle, etc. But there have been very important consultations on the regional security environment in the Bay of Bengal region. So, frankly, you don't need to talk about China directly in this case, for
Right.
example, but you can talk about the geopolitics indirectly through, for example, sea lines of communication, disaster response, counterterrorism, sharing of intelligence in terms of extremists, work on counterfeit currency, for example, and of course, insurgencies, where China has also been playing a game in parts of Myanmar. So, a lot of these discussions have led to certain trust within the region, where you now see increasingly deep and expanded discussions on what is broadly seen as national security. And that's why I mentioned the point about the Home Ministers mechanism that is going to be activated now, according to Prime Minister of India, next year, which will add a further impetus to this national security discussion within BIMSTEC. Um, Within the region. I think a third area that has been very important that I just mentioned in my previous answers on infrastructure and multimodal connectivity for the reasons I mentioned in my previous answer. The Asian Development Bank has funded massive studies on how to integrate the Bay of Bengal all the way from the eastern coast of India down to the Andaman Sea and Thailand and across the littoral in a strong hub and spoke network of ports, railways, and roads and energy lines that will carry this region forward in terms of its growth potential. And their countries have been systematically meeting and engaging and implementing initiatives on connectivity now, which means that sometimes countries do these infrastructure projects and economic corridors at home, right? They do something at home in terms of developing a port, a new railway link, but they do that in line with what are now regional expectations, right? You need your road to connect across the border with another road on the Indian side, for example, if you're building something in Myanmar. You need to develop a port in Bangladesh that is in line with supply chains that Thailand expects on the other side of the Andaman Sea, and that also feed into the northeast region of India and the rest of India. So those interlinkages now, with the support, again, as I mentioned, of the ADB, but I think growingly of other financing agencies from Japan, from the European Union, for example, are going to, I think, be seeing the results of that infrastructure upgrade in the region, which has not only, but a very strong BIMSTEC component to it.
So, is some purpose served? I mean, that's good to hear. Some purpose is being served by these, gatherings, and not just people coming and talking shop as always. I mean, that's very. I mean, I'm very very glad to hear that. So,
Ramsey, just
last.
on this point, just to, you're absolutely right. But my view again is that the summits are the final fireworks of the hard work that happens between summits. They're the final show. They're the signing of the declarations and the political element of sideline bilateral meetings and political signaling. The real work happens at ministerials, at senior official meetings, at these very sectors that work with each other every few months, they meet, and that is critical for a regional organization. And I can tell you that between 2022 and 25, the last 3 years, which were the Thailand's chairmanship of BIMSTEC, that's passing on to Bangladesh now. But over the last 3 years, we've seen a record number of such meetings in the history of 25 years of BIMSTEC. And that is eventually what carries the organization forward. Those frequent bureaucratic meetings between that are fleshing out some of these initiatives I mentioned before.
On that extremely positive note, we have run out of time, so we'll have to close this particular discussion. I do look forward to having you again because, as you know, we are doing a series on, India's attempts to um, connect with the region and the problems and the other things involved. So I look forward to having you join us for that. And thank you for taking time out for this because it's opened my eyes about a lot of things. My cynicism has already dissipated about this particular meeting. Thank you so much, and I look forward to having you again.
Thank you, Ram, for inviting me. All the best.
That was Dr. Constantino Xavier, one of the finest analysts of foreign policy and strategic affairs that I have ever met in a long, long time, talking to us about the recently concluded BIMSTEC summit, which concluded just a few hours ago. In his own frank and you know, learned way. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again. Till then, this is Ramananda Singh Gupta signing off.